Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you for joining me on this Career 3.0 podcast. My name is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work as a talent and branding evangelist. I work with organizations on helping them craft their talent strategy, and I work with individuals as they go through career transitions and ideas and help them discover the next big step that they are going to take. This particular podcast is all about fascinating career paths of people and also learning from something that they bring their expertise to. When I think about my guest on today's podcast, I want to say that this person is a keen cyclist. He's cycled about 500 kilometers in Sri Lanka, and then he's also cycled for about 1,250 kilometers. That's one hell of a distance because it's from Basel to Barcelona. Done that, enjoys cooking, skiing. But the most fascinating part that I found about him is that he actually has a service dog. He made the service dog learn enough stuff to get employed. Now, very obviously, that means this person has something to do with learning and development. And you're right, because this person also has a day job being the Chief Learning Officer for Ernst & Young, EY. Take a guess who this could be. Simon, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Abhijit. It's great to be here. I'm honored to join you.
Your new role as the Global Learning and Development Leader for EY, your prior role was the Chief Learning Officer for Novartis. This is a new role for many organizations, to really put this focus on. My question for you would be that if you were to really start thinking about writing the job description for a chief learning officer when you started doing it for the first time, and if you are doing it today, what is the difference? What will get added? What will stay constant? How would you frame it?
Yeah, so I think to answer that, I'd probably look at what's changed over the last 5 or 6 years in general, and also, what have I learned over the last 5 or 6 years that I didn't know before? And I think there's probably 2 or 3 things that really jump out. So one would be my appreciation of culture, I think, which I don't think I would have built in enough maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that culture can be a fantastic force to supercharge, if you like, everything that we're doing in the learning world. And I was really fortunate at Novartis that we had a strong culture of inspired, curious and unbossed, and that curiosity piece really powered up a lot of the work that we were doing in learning. But without that cultural force, then it's like you're sort of swimming upstream. Makes everything harder. So I think that appreciation of culture is definitely something I've learned, and that would be different probably in how I'd written things 5 or 6 years ago and how I would write them again now. I think skills and the importance of sort of tying things to a common skills framework and then going beyond learning into other HR and talent processes, so that people are hired based on skills, that people are developed based on skills, that people can see career opportunities based on skills. There's a common framework around all of that. I think those ideas were sort of emerging 5 or 6 years ago, but I think it's gone way, way further in that time and would be now a prominent part. And then generative AI wasn't even on the radar 5 or 6 years ago. AI would have been just one of the skills in probably the IT function, maybe into some of the wider digital function, but wasn't something that was really being heavily used within the learning team, and wasn't something that was one of the absolute top business priorities. Whereas today, I think it has to be a key part of the role of any learning leader to be understanding how can AI play a role within the learning function, whether that's in content creation, on content tagging, in AI coaching, or whatever that may be. But also, how can then the learning function support the business in building and understanding, so building skills around generative AI and understanding how it plays a part in the strategy. So I think that's probably 3 big parts that would have not really been there to the same extent 5 or 6 years ago, and now I think is a big part of where any learning leader needs to be focusing their efforts.
So you talked about 3 things. One, you said that the importance of culture. If you really have to make the organization continue to learn fast, culture becomes very important. The second thing that I heard you say was that, the focus on the skills economy, and part of that, how do you keep that going? And the third is also really around how Gen AI is really changing the learning function itself and how we learn inside organizations. These are the 3 big shifts, and that's really very well structured, I would say. When you look at someone who's getting started in the early days of their career, they have a lot of questions about if I want to become the chief learning officer for an organization, what is the best path to take?
It's an interesting one because my path is probably not the path that most other people would have taken to come into a chief learning officer role. I started life as an auditor. I did that for a while. I got involved in then doing some technology-based training things around software revenue recognition. And it's like, oh, this training side of things of using technology is really interesting. And I sort of pivoted my career and then did some consulting around learning and training for a while, then saw an opportunity to actually go outside and set up my own business with a colleague there. And we built an e-learning company together, then moved into consulting, did 7 years of consulting around learning, then went in-house and sort of led to learning transformation. Then the last 10 years, changed country and a range of different learning roles, culminating in chief learning officer role. So quite a varied career. I guess apart from the audit piece at the start, learning has been a consistent path through. I guess I've seen a number of different elements of in-house supplier, so sort of small supplier side, large consultant side, and seeing inside lots of organizations. So for me, I guess that's helped in seeing all those different angles and seeing it across a number of organizations. And I hope that's given me sort of some skills and knowledge to be effective in the role now. I mean, that is one path. There would be, I would say, if you're staying within the learning world, then you need to sort of see many different aspects of learning. But I would encourage people, I guess, to be dipping in and out as well of learning. That I think the value of running one's own business is then the importance of financials and cash flow and all of these pieces really hits home. Otherwise, you can't pay people's salaries and all that comes with that. And sometimes that's a little bit lost in a large organization as to some of the sort of financial basics. I think being on the consulting side and actually seeing different organizations and what works and what doesn't work and some of their challenges, I found that hugely valuable. So for leading a learning organization, I found it very valuable to have those different perspectives. I guess a little bit on the consulting side maybe is a valuable addition. I think sort of seeing a few different organizations, maybe some different industries is valuable. But reflecting, I mean, even that time in audit has been very valuable through my career in different ways. And coming into this role now is actually hugely valuable. And at the time when I was switching out, I probably looked very differently on it. But that I was leaving mid my exams, hadn't stayed on to finish my exams, which would take another 18 months. And I was like, oh, maybe I wasted that time. But actually looking back over my career, it's been hugely valuable at many points. And I don't think I'd be in the role I am now if probably hadn't had some of that foundation in audit as well.
You use the term, I wasted my time. I'm just curious, in anyone's career journey, what would count as a waste of time?
So interesting. So I reflected on that recently. And I think there's probably, even at the time when I felt that I've wasted my time, actually with hindsight, I've realized that it wasn't wasted. So that audit period felt like it was wasted, but it gave me financial basics. It gave me an understanding of how accountancy works. It gave me insight into different companies and how they prepare their accounts. So all of that actually proved valuable throughout my career. I studied German at school, at college, and 2 years at university, and then spent 15 years not speaking German, and had reflected, that was a waste of time learning all of that, not getting to it. And then suddenly I get a role in Switzerland where it's German speaking, and suddenly that background in having German suddenly comes back. And while I've forgotten a lot of it, it gave me that grounding to be useful. So I think sometimes even when we think we've wasted time on something, it's strange how life twists and turns actually shows that can be useful in some way.
I completely agree with that. I studied, I have a degree in law, and I never practiced it because, at that point of time, I thought it's not something that I could potentially do well. I sort of dropped that. And for a long time, at the back of my mind, I thought that degree in law is a waste of time. I really didn't quite use it. But when I started doing my own consulting work, I ran my own little firm. That was probably one of the most important things I did as I was signing contracts and I, was writing up contracts with other providers, etc. That was hugely useful. And so I just think that many of the things that we don't see an immediate use, it still goes into your entire sort of framework, your worldview. It shapes your worldview, and then you find a place where you can use it. You are able to use that one other lens. And I think is how I look at that. You wrote a book with a couple of other co-authors. So I really enjoyed reading your book. Just wanted to know, what is it that made you choose two other co-authors, and what was that like, the process of writing? I really enjoyed reading your book, and I thought it was fantastic. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it was prompted by a couple of people spontaneously sort of saying I should write a book about what we were doing at Novartis, and I'd never thought about writing a book. Didn't have aspirations to be an author, but like, well, if two people completely unprovoked have mentioned this, maybe I should think about it. And then was having dinner with Paul and Garrick, who I'd worked with for a while, and they'd written a book before. And so I was picking their brains, saying, these couple of people had said this to me, actually, what's involved? How did they find it when they wrote their book? And, well, actually, they'd been on the Novartis journey. They were involved at the beginning, helping to shape a workshop to come up with our strategy. They worked at various points over the years with us. They had sight of the story. They were interested in curiosity. They both knew a lot about the learning world. And so, yeah, we decided we'd embark on the journey together, write it together. And I'm very glad we did, because I think if it had just been me, I don't think I would have ended up finishing it. I would have had great intents to start, but probably wouldn't have followed it through. But actually, the three of us together, we were able to sort of motivate each other. There was the social contract that we'd say we'd do something by a certain point. We'd need to fulfill that. And we spent about a year working together, getting that written. Launched it in 2020. And ever since then, it's been great to be on the journey of having the book and then the associated podcast, and learning a lot more through that around curiosity and meeting some really interesting people along the way.
You also have a podcast called The Curious Advantage. I really enjoyed listening to that, and that's certainly it's among my top favorite ones. I was listening to a couple of them in the recent past. The one with Rita McGrath was another particularly good one, where she talks about how do you look around the edges, which to me was the essence of curiosity. How do you look beyond what is obvious and what is seen? How do you go beyond that? That's the curiosity factor. I think the link that I formed in my head was, when you are pursuing something without actually an immediate application, that is curiosity. In your case, the fact that you spent time as an auditor and understood some of the functions of the organization in depth. There was no use for it at that point of time, but it builds your worldview. In the same way, when I did a degree in law, I had no immediate usage. I wasn't practicing law. But then it sort of really changed my worldview and what I was using it many years later in a different time and shape. I think that's the value of curiosity. You are able to connect the dots at a later point of time.
Definitely. And it's often that sort of being curious about things that are maybe tangential or maybe sometimes don't even seem directly associated to the core job or the core role. Often it's in those moments of curiosity where actually things make sense and can bring it back together. On the podcast, we had Vas Narasimhan, the CEO at Novartis, and he talked about how some of his breakthroughs had been in something completely unconnected in the arts or culture, where actually suddenly something makes sense and he was able to solve something back in the here and now or for work related. So I think that's the power of curiosity, is suddenly click together from abstract principles or so forth that we can bring back and solve problems in the here and now.
In an organizational context, and especially today, public listed organizations are really focused on showing their shift on a quarterly basis, so everybody is very focused on, they forget the long term. Yes, everyone talks about it, but they are focused on the short term and say, what's it going to do for me today? Do you think that's conducive to, or does it change the way that we can leverage learning?
So I think we're all driven by the immediate benefits of something, but I think many of the things that we learn will pay out. And I mean, there's examples we talked about, they paid out way in the future. I mean, my German was 15 years in the future, and at the time it really didn't seem like it. And I think there are things like that where if we can learn it enough and retain the information, I guess that's the challenge with our forgetting curve. And we do lose track of things along the way, but sometimes that broader grounding will come back and prove beneficial in the future in different ways. Like you also studied law. I actually did evening classes when I was at college, and made a big mistake of getting the exam dates muddled up because it was evening classes rather than my day college, and I missed one of the exams and ended up getting a really bad mark because 50% of my marks are immediately gone. Same thing though, that law knowledge, which at the time seemed like it was going to not be valuable, over the years in business, contract reviews, all of these things, actually enough of that knowledge retained that it becomes useful. So I think sometimes it's hard to predict which things will actually benefit us. Maybe some of it is also through those skills that we build, we actually shape the paths that we do, that maybe some of that knowledge has actually helped and get to certain steps along the way because they're locked away somewhere.
The book that you've written about the curious advantage, I was particularly fascinated by, you talked about 12 things that you and your colleagues described this as the 12 curious ideas. One of which, for example, was really around that curiosity is the key to thriving in the new digital reality.
Yeah.
And since you've written the book, one of the biggest things that has changed is, generative AI. So therefore, that in itself proves the first part. But when you wrote that, what did you have in mind, when you said that staying curious is the key to thriving?
Well, I think that there's a lot of evidence that shows sort of the world is speeding up. And if we just look back over the last 5 years, we've seen unprecedented events with the pandemic, with the latest advances in Gen AI, and there isn't a playbook that we can refer to that says when Gen AI hits, this is what you do, step 1, step 2, step 3, and 50 companies have done this before, and this is the answer. We're faced with uncharted territory, and how do we navigate through that? How do we thrive in that environment? If I expect that I know the answer to it, I'm going to fail because there is no clear answer. And with the pandemic, there wasn't this is the way forward. With Gen AI, there isn't a do step 1, do step 2, because that's always been done. The way we approach it, we need to experiment. We need to learn from each other. We need to figure out what works along the way. We need to try things and be comfortable when those things don't work and they fail. And we then learn from that and we pivot and we adapt. And through doing that, through creating an environment where people can ask questions and can be curious, that's how we navigate through. I guess as we were writing it, we didn't realize that it would become so relevant in such a short time. We sort of accelerated the writing because the pandemic was sort of coming in around us. So if actually this is a great way for people to help navigate through that. But I think it's even more relevant now with Gen AI. And we wrote it in the context of some of the digital things that were happening. We talked about it as the greatest advantage in digital times, that's become even more prevalent, I think, with Gen AI, that, the way to navigate through it is to create curiosity in the organization and to experiment and to ask questions and to be comfortable in sharing what works and what doesn't.
This whole process of writing a book today, I find that has become infinitely more challenging because, especially when you're writing about something which has even a remote link to technology. And today, it's hard to think of a business book which has no reference to technology. Even earlier, there used to be this clear division that this is more of the people side, the human side, and this is the technology side. Today, even that is overlapping. So when you look at that, it's so hard to write because what you write today, before you finished your first draft and you've read and sort of you're looking at it, something else changes. So I kind of struggled with that when I was writing Career 3.0. It's constantly changing. So the example that you give today, you would really wish from the point of view of publication, the world would pause for a little bit so that, you can get the book out and finished. Was that how you looked at it? Because you also wrote a book during the pandemic, which was completely different time of our lives. And the whole world, in some sense, was going through a digital transformation.
Yeah, well, I'm experiencing it now. So together with Paul and Garrick and also someone else, Julian Stobb, we're actually writing the next book, if you like, which is Curious about Generative AI. So it's taking the framework that we have in the Curious Advantage and applying it into the topic of the moment of how can one be curious about generative AI, how do you navigate through it? And so, we're facing that as we're writing it, that moving so fast every day, every week, there's new elements. But interestingly, I guess the way we're writing it is less about this is the technology today. It's more the how do I navigate through it? So what are the questions that we need to ask? What are the things that need to be in place to be able to understand it and to have teams and organizations that can embrace and adopt it? And those seem to be sort of staying somewhat constant through, albeit the examples, as you say, is, is the moment one publishes it, the examples will be out of date because, it is moving so quickly.
You also tied curiosity to learning, and you said that how we learn and apply the ideas and the future of learning is really all driven by curiosity. I couldn't agree more with that. What do you think people who are not in the learning function, who are not formally pursuing L&D as their day-to-day work, what should they take from this statement?
I think a recognition that things are maybe not as we always see them, that if we hold too firmly onto what we know, what has got us to where we are, then actually that may not help us in the future. So an appetite to be constantly learning, constantly curious, constantly questioning, I think is super helpful in whatever role anyone is in, particularly as people go through into sort of leadership roles, because often the things that have made us successful and got us to where we are aren't the things that are going to make us successful in the future. And there are many areas, I think, where what we've done over the last 5 years, if we take that as the recipe for success, is not going to be the recipe for success for the next 5 years, because we're going into a very different world. So that ability to constantly question, to constantly learn, to not be too confident that what we think is right is necessarily right, and to therefore learn from others and create the environment where people can share their ideas, can ask those questions and can figure it out together what the best way forward is.
What have you personally, you used to believe it to be true and then it's no longer true? Give me an example of that.
Yeah, well, I guess, how can I look within learning? How do we create learning? How long does it take for us to create learning? What does good learning look like? What's cost effective for different solutions? A year ago, even, the way we would have created things, it might take 3 months to create a program. It would be created in certain format or whatever. Actually, now the initial high-level design and objectives maybe can be created in ChatGPT in hours, can be then validated far quicker. All of the artwork and imagery potentially can now be created using a Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever it may be. And instead of spending hours trawling for the right image or having someone design it, we can just create exactly what we need straight away. That some of the things that would have been very expensive or sophisticated in terms of simulations or some of the adaptive learning and other pieces that may be more limited to more niche use cases, maybe these are now becoming more accessible. So how I would have approached a particular solution 2 years ago as to how long things would take, how much things would cost, what's the best solution, I think all of that needs to be questioned in the light of new tools, new approaches, and also just the speed of change. Because actually, if it takes me a year to create a piece of content, now actually the world may not be the same in a year's time ready for it.
Enough has been written about how people learn and how do they unlearn. I haven't read enough about unlearning, and I'm just always intrigued.
Yeah, I think it was Brian Murphy from Microsoft, in fact, who talked about holding lightly onto what we believe to be true. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, of that we shouldn't be too fixed in anything that we believe is true, because actually there's a good chance that there's an alternative view, or actually that it's changed. I think a recognition that what we learn may be somewhat temporary, maybe a recognition there's a difference in skills as well. So if we learn some of our soft skills of communication, stakeholder management, these things, actually those will probably be quite enduring and hold true for a long time. Some of our more technical skills, prompt engineering, some of the using tools, etc., they may be great for a year or 2 years, but I suspect many of these are going to be changing far faster. So I guess a mindset of, yes, I'm learning this, but I may need to unlearn or forget or challenge this very, very quickly, depending on what it actually is.
And I also think that, being able to sort of segregate that, and I liked your definition of what are like typically called soft skills. I like to use the word people skills because
skills, yes.
Hard skills sort of gives it actually a misleading label.
You're right.
Take much longer to build, but they are far more durable. A lot of things around change. Those are the things that sustain. But on the other hand, things which you can learn pretty quickly, not to say that they don't need effort, which you can learn quickly, whether there's, all the content and domain and the laws of physics and coding and everything. But it also changes equally fast, So, the half-life of a skill in those areas is way less fast. Is failure a trigger for unlearning, or failure is failure and you kind of construct your own reality over time? Which way?
So I think it can be a prompt. I guess it depends what we mean by failure as well. So it had Amy Edmondson on the podcast recently talking about her new book, Right Kind of Wrong, of actually saying there's different types of failure. There's failure where I'm pushing new boundaries and no one knows the answer, and that's not really failure. That's just taking a risk, trying something, we learn something, we move on. So in that situation, I'm not sure it's even unlearning. I think it's actually there. It's helpful to learn from that failure, from that thing that didn't work, because we then try something else, we build on that, we question what exactly went wrong, versus a failure where actually there is a right way to do it, and it's everyone's aware there's a right way, and I decided to deviate from that, and everything went horribly wrong. I think that sort of failure we should also learn from, but ideally we learn before that failure of recognizing there is a right way. So from reflecting on that, it would be probably most failure, if not all failure, we can learn from. Some of them maybe we need to learn a different way, but there's probably something to learn from all things that don't work.
What is harder to learn from, success or failure?
So I think failure is much more powerful as a learning driver, would be my take, that if things work well, maybe we don't reflect back on what we did, but when things go horribly wrong, then we reflect far more, and it's going to give us a much deeper, deeper experience that we can learn from. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know. I always think that when things go right, we ascribe it to ourselves or our immense talent, and we say, went right because I'm so good. But when things go wrong, we always say, because that person wasn't doing this and this person. So the probability of learning from success is, I think, equally hard, which is why sometimes it's very hard for people to replicate their success, because they kind of ascribe all of it to themselves. And, you play a minuscule role even in your own success. And I think just that's a very sobering thought that, you aren't that responsible for your success. So you started by saying when you would write the role of the chief learning officer today, you would put a lot more into building a culture of learning. And that is really sometimes a missing element, that you put in, a program, the program view of learning, and then that leads to its own set of challenges.
Yeah.
We build that culture of learning because workplace culture, learning is always something that you, again, as I said, you blame others. You say that department didn't do this, or the customer that wasn't ready, or the price was not right. But how do you build a culture of learning and learning from failure and success?
And culture change is very hard. So there's no silver bullet to be able to change a culture. I think there's many factors, and there are many that will be able to talk far better than I on it. But I guess from the things that I've seen that have had an impact, I guess a mixture of very clear leadership messaging around what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, clear symbols of the culture of there is a change and this is what the new or the evolved culture would look like, tying that in through things like reward and recognition mechanisms. So I guess recognizing that a culture is a result of what we do here, and what we do here is driven by the systems and the processes that exist in the organization, and how the leaders show up and what they accept and don't accept. Mixture of communication, mixture of making sure there is the understanding and the skills and all of those elements in there as well. If specifically on a learning culture, then are people committing time to learn? Are people recognizing what learning is? I don't just mean formal learning. I mean all of those things we talked about of experimentation and being able to learn through the work that we do, and placing enough importance on that. Do I feel guilty if I'm spending time learning? Am I penalized if I spend time learning? Is there a value placed on having the most up-to-date skills and building those internally, or is it that always we'll look outside the organization to get the latest skills and never look to build those from people within? Those are all factors, I guess, that create this learning culture, and ultimately also an element around the resources that are allocated to make those things happen as well. But while the learning organization plays a part in that, it can't be driven solely from the learning organization either. It needs to be an organization's leadership that places the value around it.
That's an interesting way to frame it, because you could argue that when the shelf life of a skill drops as it has today, now the IBM research talks about the shelf life of any skill that you have is less than 3 years. So you should look at that. In which case, does that mean that the onus on keeping themselves skilled is more on the individual than on the organization? Because the organization will, yes, they will create the conditions and they will support the individual, but predominantly it's the individual who has to swim harder to be able to build that skill in real time. Is that where the world is going to be?
I would see it as a mix. So it can't be all on the organization and it can't be all on the individual. That the organization plays a role in making sure the opportunities are there in order to build the skills, whether that's through the learning resources, whether that's through experiences and opportunities and projects and role development and all of these pieces, that the organization needs to have the mechanism and the resources there. But there's also an onus then on the individual to take advantage of those resources and to put in the commitment and the motivation and to see the value from it. And it can't be all on the individual because then they wouldn't have access to the resources, and it can't be all on the company because you can't make someone do something that they don't want to do. So I would see there's a mixture therefore of the system and the resources available, and then the individual to take advantage of those and to see the benefit in building those skills. Yeah.
And I think that eventually it will boil down to the degree of curiosity of the individual to say that, here's what I want to learn. And, again, when you're looking at the future, we are all able to see what is in the immediate next step. But very often we don't look far enough, as, your example of learning German, something that happened and was a rich dividend that paid back when you started working in a country which was German speaking, but it was a foreign language when you started to learn it. What is foreign then becomes native at some stage in a connected world. A lot of time and energy is spent by organizations and individuals in providing inputs. So you learn about different pieces, and we are in that golden age. You read a bunch of things. You read this report, you hear a podcast, you watch this on YouTube, you do this. How does one connect the dots? How do you find connections? What is your process of doing it personally?
So I throw my net wide, I guess, in the hope that it sort of finds the things that are most valuable. So whether that's through, I find LinkedIn a very good source for sort of latest information. So by following a lot of interesting people on there, that's a very good source of sort of new information, articles, research, etc. Through listening to podcasts. So try to keep up, particularly with the generative AI piece. So that's moving so fast that I'm listening to sort of short, almost daily updates on what's happening there, but then also going into sort of deep learning around topics that I know very little about. Follow the Lex Friedman podcast, which I find massively interesting, where he goes sort of 3 or 4 hours into a subject, often on areas that I wouldn't have necessarily chosen to go into. But actually, when you hear about it, then it sparks ideas and connections maybe that aren't there. I think learning from others is really powerful. So there's various forums and groups that I belong to where I can meet with other learning leaders to be able to learn, what they're doing, where they found solutions that I haven't, that I can learn from them and can sort of share some of the things that we're doing as well. So between reading, listening, connecting to others, hopefully through all of those, there's then little sparks at times of things that okay, that's something I need to remember and store away for where it may be helpful and something that can reuse.
I always think that in a time-starved world that we live in, you get a lot of inputs, but you don't have enough time to connect the dots. And I think that is probably the real casualty of learning, that you know a bunch of different things, but you don't piece it together to make sense. So that's I think the tragedy of today. What is better to learn, bite-sized content or long form? You mentioned Lex Friedman. Some of these are, they're 3-4 hour podcasts. And then there are these learn leadership in 30 seconds kind of things. Which of these do you think really should people be looking at in order to build skills?
Specifically to build skills, I think it's more the longer form applied elements, but to build knowledge and understanding, then maybe the shorter form pieces. And I think that's where I think maybe as an industry, we can often generalize about learning as a single need rather than actually separating out. There are times where we need deep learning to apply ourselves over a long period of time. And coming into EY now, something like learning to be an accountant, there is a lot of knowledge. There's some complex elements there. Need to be applying that and learning that over time. And it's hard work, and it's building out a deep skill. And that's not going to come from a 5-minute podcast and reading 2 articles. It needs that deep application of thought and learning in order to be able to build out those skills. So that would be, I guess, an example where it needs to be long form, if you like, and really sort of applied learning. But then many other things we can learn through listening, through reading, through getting in bite-sized chunks, and we can pick it up over time and we can piece those bits together, and it gives us that knowledge, and maybe some of that knowledge over time becomes a little bit more towards a skill as well. But so I think it's back to the age-old, right solution for the right job, and there's a place for all of these things, and it just depends what we're trying to achieve from it.
Personally, I find it very useful to hear podcasts which is one person really doing a deep dive, and the longer form podcasts are particularly useful. I like that. But I find that when I listen to in a conference, at some of the firm conferences, when I kind of find that they have people on the stage, 3 or 4 people discussing something which I already know a little bit about. When you hear them bring their different ideas, and one person represents one company or a sector or, different levels of experience, when they talk about it, that is when a lot of things come together. So hearing a panel discussion is for me very enlightening, especially if it is done well. It can really piece together some of the ideas in my head. What's your writing routine like? How often do you write? How do you structure it? Tell me all about it.
Yeah. So currently I would say distracted because of throwing myself into a new role. So prior to starting this, it would have been blocking chunks of time to think about a particular area, often driven by a particular piece of research or whatever as well. So actually tying that back into those sort of bite-sized learning pieces. Often as I'm looking at LinkedIn or reading articles or whatever, I'll be tagging things of, this is a useful piece that is a useful data point or a useful principle or whatever, that I can stick that in as something to then think about in my writing in order to be able to reflect upon and see if there's a place there. But it's typically done in this room here. I shut the door and give myself a couple of hours and try and contribute to it. But my writing's all been done as well in a collaborative way, and so therefore with regular check-in points with Paul, Garrick, and Julian now with the new book, that to just check how are we progressing, and how do we want to break things up between us, and what do we want to do. So,
how does it work? Do you take 3 different chapters of a book and you distribute it among 3 people, or are all of you writing the same chapter and then you piece together? Which of the 2 is?
So we're following a similar model to the way we did with the first book, which is sort of very high level sort of chapter headings as a starter. And then this one is helped by, we have our 7 C's model that is providing the sort of core of it. So we apply the 7 C's in. So it's essentially a sort of set of introduction content. Then we apply the 7 C's model and then some takeaways and things from it. And then within each of those chapters, we start with a sort of, okay, what are we going to cover? A sentence or two becomes paragraph or 2, drop in sort of case studies and data points and things. And then we work through and we each go in and do elements that we find relevant to us, which will then give us something that probably doesn't flow. And then we'll need to do a cleanup at the end where we go through and say, okay, now from all of these individual pieces, let's make that flow into something that works end to end. And with this one, it's going to be also a lot more resources and things in there, so checklists or guides to things to think about or whatever. So we'll try and make this much more practical of how one can work through within one's team or individually about being curious about AI.
When you see the future of the learning profession, the learning and development team, when you look at that, how do you view this changing? Because today, the opportunity to learn from anyone and everywhere is just democratized, that you can just go to YouTube and hear the best of speakers. You can read the most books. They are available today. It's just download away kind of thing. In a world of abundant resources, does the corporate learning and development team still have a role? If so, what is that role?
Yeah, so I think there definitely will be a role. I think it's going to be an intriguing exercise to sort of envision what does learning look like in 3 to 5 years' time. I think there's still going to be a place where you have things created in-house on how the organization does things. So while, yes, there's great content out there on the internet. There's also a lot around, but this is how we do it. This is our processes. This is our principles. This is what differentiates us. And therefore we need our own in-house learning as well. But I think when you explore sort of where AI is going and on not just how we create learning in terms of sort of how we do what we do today better using AI, but more than when we think, well, what can AI actually do to transform what learning looks like? And also then, what does learning look like in a world where we're all using AI? If I'm spending my days in Copilot or maybe Copilot 3.0 in the future, where I'm actually just talking to my assistant Copilot and it's doing my work for me, and we're having sort of discussions around how to do things, and it's creating presentations and it's writing code and it's doing all of these pieces. How do I learn in that? That's a fascinating question. And what does then a learning organization look like there? I think there will still be a place for structured learning. Back to what we were just saying, there's certain things where you need that structured learning approach because it's complex, but there will also be a lot of just-in-time things maybe where AI is either doing things for us or is actually coaching us and guiding us as we go. We had Sal Khan on the Curious Advantage podcast recently, and he was talking about Khan Migo, which is the AI assistant that they've built into the Khan Academy. And that was fascinating. It was now probably a year ago. It was using ChatGPT 4 that they built that, and it guides students through the content. It doesn't give them the answers, but it plays the role of a teacher, and it gets to know what they like, and it presents things. They like football, it will talk about it, an analogy of football so they can understand it and things, and it really helps them learn. And that should be applied into a corporate environment. So actually we have our AI assistant coaching us and helping us as we go. Maybe it's the learning team's role to help teach the AI in order to be able to then provide what's needed. I don't know. I think it's a fascinating question. I think to start to explore, what does it mean in a world abundant with AI?
We are coming up towards the end of our conversation. I want to sort of have your views on the process of onboarding, which I also think is deeply linked to learning. So in this case, the individual gets a chance to learn about the organization which he or she is entering into. My view of onboarding is that it's always extremely one-sided in the sense that there's a certain amount of knowledge that the person needs to pick up. It's sort of really from the organization to the individual, and it can be done in different ways, through meeting people, presentations, conversations, all of that. I think the big missing piece of design in my mind is that organizations do not make space for that individual to come in and sort of really say that this is what's already going on. You need to figure out which piece of the puzzle you are going to be and just do that. But the puzzle itself doesn't change to allow for that individual to come in and, bring the learning of this person. So there's a lot of time wasted in organizations onboarding this person to learn this new language, so to say, but not leverage enough of what language this person already speaks. How do you define it, and, what is the role of onboarding?
Yeah, so I guess I'm living it at the moment. So as we record this, I think it's day 20 or something in my new role. So I guess my lived experience for the last 20 days of it is actually a very positive one of a real willingness to want to hear the observations of someone coming in from outside and those ideas. But I think that's quite unusual from what I hear from many organizations, that actually at least the sort of stereotypical view being that you come into the organization and this is how it's done around here, you learn the way that it's done, and no one wants to hear the new ideas. And I think it was Google, I think, that was held up as a role model there around actually in the first 60 days trying to extract as much information as possible from the new person, because after 60 days you go native, but actually in that first time, that's when there's that, why are we doing it like that? Or that seems a very strange way to do it. Did you know there's a different way? So I think in looking at onboarding, I think that two-way element is way more powerful than just learn about the company, forget everything you knew before, or don't create the opportunities to see that fresh pair of eyes looking at things and being able to see maybe opportunities where things could be done differently.
In the traditional learning model, it's the sage on stage versus a two-way kind of a learning process, which learning today is all about. And I think that's a shift that most organizations would do well to recast their onboarding and sort of make it not here is the wisdom you need to fit into, but sort of really try to see then what is it that you observe, what do you bring in to leverage that to make the fastest amount of changes, to use that as an opportunity for the organization to also grow, or at least be prepared to make those shifts. So I think that's wonderful. We are really at the end, and I just wanted to ask you for your favorite motto that inspires you to learn. What would that be?
I've always go back to one of my my favorite films of growing up with the Dead Poets Society, and the carpe diem of seize the moment. That I think there's always opportunities for us to be learning, but do we grab them? Do we embrace them, or do we look the other way? So I'd go with seize the moment.
Thank you so much, Saiba. It was lovely talking to you, and look forward to continuing our conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, Abhijit.